sages have a teaching in the ethics of our fathers, Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a mentor, uknei lecha chaver, acquire for yourself a friend, and to judge people favorably. And in many ways, these three are cardinal principles in the world of recovery. But not to focus on all of them. Of course, the first one seems to be self-understood. Make for yourself a mentor, the idea of mentorship. So once you enter the program, they encourage you to make for yourself a mentor, to find a sponsor, somebody who is going to guide you in your work, in your spiritual work. Very critical, extremely critical. But that we're not going to focus on today. The idea of uknei lecha chaver, acquiring for yourself a friend, which I think really is about the idea of fellowship and community. Because in our suffering, in our insanity, in our pain, we imagine that we are alone in the world. There is no other human being who could ever understand what we suffer, how we suffer. And certainly, if any human being would catch a glimpse into our ugliness, we would be condemned for eternity. And that is something that contributes even more so to the guilt and the shame, which of course fuels this endless cycle of insanity, because I actually brought the book, but I'm not going to read from it, but Gabor Mate, anybody who wants some of the most incredible insight into addiction, where he describes in the first chapter the 5 different realms, but he describes the realm of the hungry ghost, which is actually the title of his book. And he describes this realm, the people who find themselves who are trapped in this realm, because most human beings kind of shift between one or the other, but an addict is stuck in the realm of the hungry ghost. And there is an insatiable longing and thirst, but an emptiness. And it's, he once describes an addict, he says, because he's trying to understand addiction. And so he's kind of, interviewing his patients. And he says to this one fellow, he says, why do you keep using? And well, I keep using so that I don't have to feel what I feel if I don't use. So most people would never be able to understand that. We talk about this here all the time. It's perfectly normal to have had a stressful day, and at the end of the day, you carry all of that stress with you, and you're looking to take the edge off. That's perfectly normal. So whether you listen to music, or maybe you need a glass of wine, or you might even act out compulsively, but that is not the insanity of addiction. To the addict, and we talked about this last week, we talked about the idea of in that. Somebody mentioned here last week in this room that when he wakes up in the morning, in his first moment of consciousness, he's already fighting. He's already on the defensive. Already. So for an addict, it's what do you mean? I'm using to survive because I can't sit with myself, because I can't stand to sit with myself. So if that's something that you identify with, then you must find your way to a room. And why is that? What is the magic? What is the power in that room? What do we find there in that room? We find uknei lecha chaver. First of all, we find in the stories that are shared in those rooms, we suddenly find, I'm not the only one. I see that other people struggle with some of the same things that I struggle with. That's powerful. There's also a community of people who are working a spiritual program, again, without preaching, but are sharing what worked for them, their own personal experiences, their stories of strength and hope. Very, very powerful. We find compassion in the room. We find acceptance in the room. We find healing in the room. And that's so powerful. To be part of a community. It's a safe space because there's absolutely no judgment there. Who would get up to judge somebody else? Seriously, right? Yours is uglier than mine. I mean, there is no judgment in the room. But there is an incredible power of a community of people who are searching for something, and they get together and everybody shares. So that's the idea of, and again, because it's broader today, and perhaps there are more people that are watching, so certainly if you're local and you want to participate in a community of people who are seeking something deeper and something higher. You know, we always talk that for the experience of people that have sat in on meetings. Again, I'm looking back at some of the group that's been here for a long time before, but somebody shared that he was working his program and his wife would say, all you talk about is the addiction, and the addiction, you're obsessed with this thing. And yes, maybe in the beginning that's what you're kind of obsessed with, but recovery is nothing to do with that. Yes, recognizing that my old roadmap was a broken, faulty roadmap, and it was leading me deeper and deeper and deeper, bringing me to death's door every day, every moment. And I couldn't imagine that there was any other way. Couldn't imagine. And some people can't help themselves, because not to feel that and not to sit with that is even more important than their own life. That's how desperate they are. That's how desperate. But recovery is really about discovering a new spiritual path, a new framework, a new outlook. And typically the people who are in recovery for an extended period of time, who are not, it's not about the addiction or the disease at all. It is about working these spiritual principles. It's about discovering something, a deeper insight, a deeper way. But one more thing that I want to share with you, which is also what this is about. So it's 1935, and a stockbroker from New York who's been suffering from he's an alcoholic for years and years and years, and not to go into all the details of the story, but somehow he's found that over the course of 3 months, nothing has worked. He's tried everything, okay, but he finds that when he feels the urge, if he reaches out and tries to help another alcoholic, somehow it relieves him of the urge to drink himself. And so that's what he does for 3 months, and he's been clean for 3 months doing this work, just doing for other people, getting outside of himself. But now he's in Akron, Ohio, and he's traveling there. He's staying in the hotel somewhere, and he suddenly feels this urge, and he doesn't really know anybody locally. So he's desperate. I got to talk to another alcoholic, because he knows that that's what works. He doesn't know why it works, but he knows that it works. So he describes how he's walking. His name is Bob, but he's Bill, excuse me. But he describes how he's kind of pacing between the bar and the phone booth, and he's going back and forth, and finally the phone booth wins. Thank God. And he picks up the phone book and he starts to call clergy to see if there's anyone in their congregation or anyone that they know who's suffering, who's struggling with, who's an alcoholic. And eventually he finds one that leads him to a doctor, yes, and he's been struggling with it, and his wife has been going crazy trying to help him. And of course, the two of them together become the founder and the co-founder of AA. And that's something powerful in that. So we always bring in an idea of, because this is based on Jewish spirituality, but of course it's not exclusive. We have members of all faiths that are here, because spirituality, of course, is universal, and the spiritual truths of the Bible are eternal and universal. You don't have to be Jewish to appreciate them, to celebrate them. So we are just coming up on a holiday. We're going to experience this holiday before we see each other next week, which is going to be, God willing, on Wednesday at 5:30. But between now and then, we have the festival of Purim. And not to take you through the whole history, but it's an absolutely fascinating story. And they wanted to kill us, we won, and then we sit down and we eat. No, that's the long short of it. But there's something interesting. So, and there are some fascinating dynamics about the story, but the story is that, yes, there was an evil man, and his name was Haman, and he was in a position of power. He was one of the ministers of the king at that time. And all of the Jewish population lived This was a major king. His name was Achashverosh, and he commanded 127 provinces, and we were scattered amongst those 127 provinces. So, to make the long story short, the fate of the Jews are in his hand, and he allows Haman, one of his wicked ministers, to purchase the fate of the Jews for a few coins, and he can do whatever he wants. And Haman basically devises this plot that on a single day, all of the population will rise up against the Jewish population and wipe everybody out in one day. Okay? Do you know the story? It's a great story. But anyway, as it happens, because of something that had taken place a number of years before, the queen actually, at that time, was Queen Esther. The king had no idea she was Jewish. That's another story. There's a lot of stories. So she's there, and her uncle Mordechai, uncle or husband, but her uncle Mordechai, who's a leader of the Jewish people, basically reaches out to her, and he says to her, you're in that position, and you've got to help us. You've got to go to the king, and you've got to let him know that you're Jewish, and you've got to do whatever you can to save the Jewish population. And Queen Esther says to him that, not very different than it is today, but this king was mad with power. Mad with power. And so if he didn't call on you and you called on him, so it all depended on his mood. If he wasn't in the mood to see you, he'd have your head. And she was his wife, never mind. But she hadn't been called. She could only go to him if she was called. She hadn't been called in 30 days. So she says to Mordechai, I understand it's an urgent matter and I need to ask for an audience with the king, but I'm basically risking my life here. And he says to her three things. He says, salvation will come, the Jews will be redeemed. If you don't take initiative, it will come from another place, right? Because God has many messengers, not a single messenger. And perhaps in doing so, in not taking initiative now, what will happen to you and your father's home? They will be destroyed. But then he says something extremely profound to Esther. He says, Umi odea, who knows? Perhaps it is for this reason, you may be wondering, for a young Jewish girl to end up as the queen to Achashverosh, to imagine what she was going through. And this wasn't for a day or a month, it was for years. To be there in that kind of environment, to have to tolerate, again, not to get into all of the details, but this was self-sacrifice every day for her to be there. And he says, maybe it is for this reason that all of these events brought you to that place so that you could serve as the agent through which salvation would come to the Jewish people. Who knows? But so some people say, what do you mean, who knows? Who knows? In other words, it's a toss-up. There's a young man who just discovered that he's an addict. And we've been talking back and forth. And after his first meeting, he texts me, why me? You know that feeling, why me? Because when you're in the throes of addiction, so you're just so hyper-focused, there's nothing beyond just surviving and just how am I going to get my next hit or how am I going to set up my next acting out, and you're just so in the throes of it that you don't really think broader on any other. It's just, I got to survive. You don't understand. I need to survive. That's all. But suddenly when that stops and you're not acting out and you're not using and you're sitting with your pain, and maybe you go to your first meeting and you suddenly it starts to dawn on you what insanity you've been dealing with and how many relationships you've destroyed and how much you've lost. We talked about the other week somebody describing a 40-year struggle with addiction. 40 years. What it means to lose 40 years before you discover. 40 years. It's the burden is so overwhelming that the only thing that you're thinking is, I better act out again, or I better use again, because this is too much for me to bear. Too much, too painful, too painful. Mordechai wasn't saying to Esther, well, who knows? Maybe it is for this reason, maybe it's not, because what's behind that? I mean, how does that encourage her to say, maybe this is my moment? Maybe this is your moment, maybe it's not. That doesn't sound very compelling if he's trying to sound very compelling. He's trying to weigh in on the situation. So he could say, listen, if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. Or he could say, well, if you don't do it, we're all going to die. Okay, that might be getting to me. But hey, listen, you should do it because maybe it's your reason for being, maybe it's not. Maybe God put you there for a reason. Maybe he didn't. And I just want to tie all of these things together because you realize something. That once we turn ourselves over to the care of God of our understanding, and once we realize that it has nothing to do with us, it's all about him, because the car is his, and the $20 is his, and the home and the family is his, and everything belongs to God. And I am only here to serve his will for me. And that's what we pray for every day. But one of the powerful things that happens in the room is that we're able to reach out and we are able to be in the service of other people. And that's not what Mordechai is saying to Esther is, no, this is, if you're here in this situation, then of course, this is your destiny and you're meant to be there. Now, mi odea, in other words, means, but it's something that we can't ever grasp because most human beings could never grasp why God would put them in this way. Why me? Why me? I mean, why couldn't I just be like everyone else? Why do I have to be the one suffering with this? Why did I have to lose 40 years of my life? Why is it that in my first moment of consciousness, I'm not even comfortable sitting with myself? Like the rabbi said before, no one has ever invited this onto themselves. No one has ever invited this onto themselves. No one has ever wished for this, which again is something that I think we need more and more awareness in the broader community because, of course, but you were enjoying it. Come on. No, hating yourself while you're doing it. Again, Gabor Mate describes one of his patients as talking, and he's talking about how I think it's meth or whatever it is that he's using, and how it makes him nauseous, and he hates it, and he doesn't even like it. But since he took the first hit, and he does this every day, he does it over and over and over and over again. And he says to him, so why do you do it if you know that you're going to feel sick and you can't stand it and you hate it and you don't want to be doing it? Because to him, he doesn't have a choice. It's about his own survival. So you say, why me? But to imagine that God has a unique plan for each and every one of us. And this is his plan. As I heard from somebody else in this room that said, a victim of child sexual abuse, that if he would be given the choice to rewrite his life story, he would write it with his abuser in it. Now, mi odea, nobody could ever understand why this is the unique journey for me. But if we accept that God has that unique journey for each and every one of us, and that through our awareness, we are in a position to be able to help so many other people by sharing our strength and hope. By sharing our strength and hope. Then perhaps one day we do reach a place where we say, maybe not ani odea, that I know fully and I understand fully, but I accept that this is the mission for me.